Hi everyone, thank you for joining me. My name is Joe, I'm the training officer at the Art Society House, and I'm going to do a really quick tutorial that just covers the buttons or the different meeting controls, as Zoom calls them, that you have available to you in a meeting. So I have my meeting ready to go here. Let's get started. Do I want to open Zoom meetings? I do. This opens the app. If you're hosting, which I'm about to do here, and actually if you're an attendee, it's always better if you go into a Zoom meeting or webinar using the app, because you'll always have the most up-to-date version. So you'll always have all the buttons available to you. So if I open Zoom meetings, okay, here we are. You can see I've had a little notification. It says cannot start video. The reason for that is because my video is already being, my computer's video is already using the video tutorial software here, and it can't use two softwares at the same time. So we won't have me in the Zoom meeting, but if you were to join a meeting as I have just done and you weren't using video recording tutorial software, then you would be able to see yourself here. So I'm in a Zoom meeting, and here are the buttons that I'm going to go through at the bottom. Before I get started, it's worth saying that you'll notice if I keep my mouth still for a moment, just away from the buttons, that they'll disappear, as they've just disappeared for me. That is just so that you have a better view of what's happening in the meeting if you're not using the buttons. If you want them to appear again, simply just move your mouse and they'll pop up. So from left to right, here on the far left, we've got the microphone button. It says mute. This is how you will mute or unmute yourself. You can see that it's receiving a sound signal from my voice because of the little green sign that's bouncing up and down there. It's literally just a case of clicking it to mute yourself. You have the red line that goes through it there, or unclicking it to unmute yourself. It's better to, unless you're actually speaking in the meeting or unless it's your turn to speak, I would advise having it muted. It just means that there's no chance of you accidentally interrupting what's happening in the meeting. The video would usually be by default on here, but as we saw when I tried to enter the meeting, my video camera is already in use, so it's off here. But it's the same as the mute here. With both of these buttons, there's a little arrow beside them. Clicking on that arrow kind of gives you a list of different options, but that's all quite technical and you shouldn't need to use them. But feel free to explore them if you like. These buttons are available to everybody in a meeting, the host and the attendees. But these buttons are only available to the host and the panelists in a webinar. Attendees do not have the option to unmute themselves, and they do not have the option to use their video. This next button is another button that I only have the view of as I am the host of this meeting, security. If I click that, it opens a list. I have the option to lock the meeting if I don't want to let anyone else in. I have the option to enable a waiting room if it hasn't been enabled already. It has for me, hence the tick. And then I have these other options: share the screen, chat, rename themselves, unmute themselves for participants. There isn't any right way to do that. It really depends on how you want the meeting to work. The next button along is participants. You'll notice that when I click the participants button, a window appears on the right-hand side. That reduces the space that we have here, and so you'll see that we actually lose some of the buttons that we did have listed. They don't disappear, they're actually just shoved into this more button here. So if I click that button, you'll see that I have the chat and the breakout rooms, which actually, if I uncheck the participants, I have them here. So they don't disappear, they just go into the more button when I click participants and the window appears. The participants list is really important for a host. As the host, you'll need to manage the people that are in the meeting. As it's just myself, I'm the only person that's listed here, but the more people there are, they will all be listed here. You'll have the name, you'll have their role if they have one. For me, it says host. For a co-host, it would say co-host. And for an attendee, it wouldn't say anything there. And it says me because it is me. You can see that on the right-hand side, I have the option to see that my mic is unmuted. If I mute my mic in the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see it goes red. That will be the same for all the attendees. So that's quite a good way if you're the host and one of your attendees has forgotten to unmute themselves, and I don't know, you're having a really efficient conversation in a committee meeting, and there's some noise coming from somewhere and you can't work out where it's from. This is quite a good place where you can see that, because if everyone's muted except for one person, you'll know that the noise is coming from there. And if you hover over the name of people, you have the option to mute them here. As the host, you have that option. And if you click more, you won't see it here because I'm clicking this on myself. But if I was the host and I clicked the more button on somebody else's name, I would have a larger drop-down list where I would have the option to do things like make them the co-host if they're not one already, make them an attendee if they are already a co-host, or I could ask them to turn their video on or off. I could ask them to unmute themselves, things like that. At the bottom, you'll see different buttons. I haven't seen these used too often, but they're just a way that you can send a message to the host. Yes, no, go slower. There's an invite button, which again, I haven't used too often. It's a way that you can invite people to the meeting while it's in progress. There's a mute all button, which you might find useful as the host. And if you click this button furthest on the right, there are a few more options that you can choose to use. If you have a waiting room enabled, then there will be a little box partitioned at the top here. That will be the waiting room, and you'll be able to see a list of people in the waiting room there. You'll have the option to admit them individually, or you'll have the option to admit them all at the same time. And you just close the participants panel here by clicking the button that you used to open it again. The next button along is polls. I won't go into that because I have a separate video tutorial on the training site that covers that. Next furthest along is chat. Again, if I click that, it opens in the left-hand side and we lose some of the buttons here. The chat panel is quite a good way that you can communicate with the meeting without unmuting yourselves and kind of stopping everybody in its flow. So as I'm the only person here, I only have the option to send it to everyone in the meeting. But if there were more people, I could send it to people privately, or I could send it to just the host. But you can say something like hi, and it will write it in the chat panel, and if somebody doesn't have their chat panel open, it will show as a pop-up. You'll notice what happens if I have the chat panel and then I click participants. It actually gives me both. It partitions the chat panel and the participants panel in half. So now I have half participants panel and half chat. You remove them in the same way that you opened them. My chat button has been sandwiched into more. I can click and remove it there. Share screen is really important because that is the way that a lecturer would be sharing their screen to their PowerPoint. Share screen button will be the same in a webinar. If you want to share your screen, then you can click the button and you have various sharing options here. And you can click these buttons at the bottom to include the sound from your computer. So that's particularly useful if you're sharing a video and you want to be able to hear what's being said. You have some advanced options here, which you can choose to use if you like. And then you just click share to begin sharing. This button to the right here is actually pretty important, especially if you're hosting a lecture. You'll want to click it just to double check that all the settings are in order. These two, they're not too important for me. In fact, I'd prefer just one participant to be able to share at a time. But the advanced sharing options, you can see here who can share, either only the host or all participants. If you were managing the meeting or webinar and you were the host and the lecturer wasn't the host, but in a webinar, a panelist, or in a meeting, a participant, then you would need to check this box in order to allow the lecturer to share their screen. So it's just one of those things that's just always wise to check when you first open the meeting or webinar. The record button does just that. If you click that, a recording notification comes up in the top left-hand corner, and that goes to everybody else that's in the meeting. I would advise just checking with everyone that that's okay before you do so, because people would usually prefer the permission. Breakout rooms is another button that I do a separate video or tutorial on, which is on the training site, so I won't go into that. And reactions is a button that you can click. It gives you the option to send this to people. Thumbs up or hysterics. You can't remove the face manually. It just stays there for a few seconds and then disappears on its own. The next button along is more. And as I have all these here, the only options that we have in the more button are the live streaming buttons. Again, live streaming I'll be covering in a separate tutorial, so I won't go into that here. That's all of the buttons that you have available to you in a meeting. Some of these buttons aren't available in a webinar, such as breakout rooms. And if you're just an attendee, then you won't have access to buttons like security, polls, or breakout rooms. These buttons are only available to the host of a meeting. Also, buttons like polls and like breakout rooms are buttons that need to be enabled in your account's settings before you start, otherwise they won't appear here. As the host, you can end it, or you could just click the cross and just leave. But that's the meeting controls. Ciao for now. See you next time.